Okay. So, we are moving to the next part of this session on competency mapping, and in this third session basically we are going to discuss about some of the tools and techniques that is used for assessment and feedback, and we will also discuss that how we collect data in order to identify various competencies which is required for effective performance. And in this context what we are going to discuss is some of the tools and techniques that could be used for higher performance. Now, when we are talking about tools and techniques are, so first of all we have to see what are the various methods of competency mapping. How do we go about mapping competencies of the people, right? See, why businesses are using competency mapping? Okay. So, that they can match the capability of the people with the job or the requirement of the organization. So, the idea of competency mapping here is to identify the capabilities and talent of the people on the one side, and also the tasks and the requirements of the organization. So, basically you try to match, you start with what you call the need of the organization. In terms of what kind of competencies organizations require, right, and this competence is going to the jobs, right. What kind of competence would be required by the people to perform the job, right, job or role competence, right. And when you are going to do this, you are basically matching two things, the job that is going to perform by the individual and the knowledge, skill and attitude that the individual has. So, this has to be matched at this level. So, there is a compatibility in terms of competence to perform, and then you have to see that it is coming from here, the competence that is required by the organization, because the core competence of the organization depends upon the competence of the people, okay, to perform the job effectively. Okay. So, the competence the associated with the job is nothing but the knowledge, skill and attitude that people have. So, when you are going to use this competency mapping framework, the idea is that you match the this capabilities and the talent of the people with the task or the role that they are going to perform, which is basically helping to see that this the needs and the objectives of the organization is achieved, right. So, with this we proceed further to discuss. So, what are the various techniques through which you are going to analyze the core competence of the people or the behaviors of the people, so, to know that whether they are performing their job effectively or not. Okay. So, one approach that we have used is the job description approach to identify the competencies and see that what the resources are required to fulfill the competency needs. Another approach is that you identify a benchmark job, identify what the various characteristics in terms of competencies, okay, and see that whether the people can be developed to that level of competencies to perform the job effectively or not. And both these approaches are used when it comes to competency mapping, right. So, what we are going to discuss here when I am talking about the competency mapping, that what are the various tools and techniques that we use for competency mapping, and in order to identify the characteristics. So, if you remember, we talked about two things, two approaches, that is the job analysis approach or the job description approach and the competency framework. Now, if you look at this competency framework, we identify a benchmark job, right, done by a competent individual, right. So, you have to identify a benchmark job when you are using this competency framework to see that who is doing it. So, once you identify this competent individual who is performing the job, then you look at his characteristics in terms of knowledge, skill, attitude and these kind of things. And then what you are going to do next? You are going to see that it is matched with the competencies of others doing similar jobs. Okay. If there is no gap, then it is good. If there is a gap, then you have to bridge this gap through various interventions, right. So, this is basically the competency approaches. So, when we are talking about this competency approach, we have to identify a person who is doing a job and who is considered as a high competent individual performing his job very well. So, we are going to look at his characteristics. Now, the question here is that how to identify those characteristics. And for that you are going to use certain tools and techniques. In job description approach, what happens? You have fixed roles and responsibilities, right. You have fixed knowledge, qualification, experience, okay. And then you are going to match this. The gap is identified and then you plan intervention, HRD intervention, right, in terms of training, development, coaching, mentoring, whatever it is. Here also you also offer the same kind of intervention to bridge the gap, but how do you derive these competencies differs. In this case, this basically you compare that knowledge and skill is actual and standard performance and then you identify the gap. But in this case, when you are using a competency approach, you identify individual, a high performing individual, and then through observations you are able to identify what are the various characteristics that he has, because you are going to use these characteristics as a benchmark for comparing people doing similar jobs to identify the gap in the competencies. Okay. Now, the idea is that how we are going to identify these characteristics which leads to superior performance, and that is where you are going to use a lot of tools and techniques which I am going to discuss now, right. So, both the approaches are used, but this is a relatively better approach, because in this case this has come from the field, this is based on observation, this is something that has come from the literature, academic literature, management theory, which is preconceived, and this is actually more real, right, and that is how we are moving to this one. Now, one thing that can be done, one tool that is used here is known as assessment center. Okay. Some of the organizations have their own assessment center, some of the organizations outsource it, but the basic role of an assessment center is to identify people, okay, to know what are the various characteristics that he has for high potential. Okay. So, when you are using this assessment center approach methodology, so what actually happens, you are going to say what this high performing individual is doing, right, correct, which is related to a specific job, and based on the job observations, when you evaluate his performance and find that yes, he is a high performing individual, okay, then you are going to identify him, and then you also identify what various traits and characteristics that is displayed by that individual. Okay. You can engage him in discussion, you can interact him, you can go for some kind of exercises to find out this, okay, so that you know that what are the various underlying characteristics which the individual has, okay, which leads to better performance. Okay. What you need a person as a assessor who is going to observe the behavior of high performing individual or high competent individual. But if you are using this assessment center for training and development intervention, then you are going to see that whether the person is performing what he is supposed to do, or right. So, that is where you differentiate it. So, in an assessment center, when you are going to identify a high potential individual, you are going to conduct certain structured exercises, certain tests, okay, which will help you to identify whether the person has those competencies or not. So, the idea is to find out the skills and aptitude of the people, which could be related to high competence, right. So, you can go for simulated exercises, you can go for role plays, you can go for some kind of other exercises, structured exercises, okay, scenario planning, role plays, games, simulated exercises. The idea of using this kind of methodology in assessment center is to see that in these contexts or situations, people are coming out with their attitude and skill. Okay. So, you will be able to identify their attitude and skill, and then you are going to match it with someone who is already performing very well on the job, right. And that is where assessment centers have been very useful to identify the growth potential of the people, right. Apart from assessment center, there is another method that is used, which is known as 360-degree feedback. Okay. In 360-degree feedback, what happens? You try to get a feedback which is much more comprehensive and which involves a number of stakeholders. Okay. Because if you are going to use a normal feedback process using if you are using only performance appraisal, you do not get a comprehensive feedback. Okay. You might get feedback from the seniors or you might get feedback from the person itself, okay. And there could be certain qualities which is not revealed by the individual or the seniors are not able to observe them. There are certain qualities which could be observed by the customers, certain qualities by the peers or certain qualities may be by the subordinates. Okay. So, what happens, since the individual is going to interact with a set of people, okay, at different levels, at the same level, the higher level, at the junior level. Okay. So, when you are going to use this 360-degree feedback, you get a better perception of the individual in terms of his competencies, in terms of his performance, right. And that is why 360-degree technique have also been used as a mechanism for evaluating performance of the people too. Okay. Now, if you look at this 360-degree technique, okay, it actually involves collection of data from a set of people. Now, in fact, in 360-degree technique, what happens here? You have an individual here, right. So, this individual is being evaluated in a 360-degree way. Okay. This could be the superiors, they could be subordinates, right. Here you can have customers and here you can have fellows, colleagues and the individual itself, right. Now, you see that in a 360-degree technique, you are going to be evaluated in a very comprehensive way. Okay. And the criteria for evaluation also varies from one set to another set of evaluators, which gives you a more comprehensive data about not only the knowledge part, but the skill and attitude part. Okay. This is used to identify gap in a much more comprehensive way. Okay. So, if you are using this kind of technique for identifying the competencies, you can use it provided you are using the criteria which is related to higher performance, not the standard performance. That is the only difference that you have. So, basically you get a better perception about the individual behavior, okay, with respect to his superiors, subordinates, colleagues, internal and external customers, right. And that is why 360-degree feedback has been very often used and very common. And sometimes what happens that when you try to make use it, sometimes you will find that some of them have not given their evaluations about the individual. So, if you do not get complete evaluations, then it is not possible for you to go for these kind of things. Interestingly, in one case where we went for a 360-degree evaluation of all managers, okay, in a particular case in one steel organization, we found that in many cases some of them have not given their evaluation. Sometimes it has certain drawbacks, because if you give evaluation about your seniors and they come to know about it, they would be vindicative to you, right. So, you need to adopt certain processes or mechanism to ensure that this kind of feedback process is foolproof. You are able to get a comprehensive picture with respect to all the stakeholders in the process, including yourself, and that is how you get a better data, right, about the individual. Right. And when you are going to go for competency mapping, you have to see that these feedbacks are specific to the competencies which is related to his success as a superior performer or contributing to organizational performance. So, you need to identify those key competencies and then you have to map them. Then another technique that is used is known as critical incident technique. Okay. Here you are going to use and collect data by observations of specific behaviors, okay, which leads to either success or failures. Okay. So, why we call it critical incident? There is the reason, because you are not going to observe those behavior which could be normal and routine in nature, which a person performed or which person does in order to perform his job effectively, right. So, we leave out the standard average behavior or routine work related activities which a person is doing. Okay. We focus more through observations on those critical incidents, and why we call them critical incidents, because they lead to either success or failures, not average performance, right, and that is why we call it critical incidents. So, what actually happens, these critical incidents, when they are identified, you know that these incidents lead to better performance or worse performance. Okay. So, you can say okay, these are the critical activities or incidents which the person has done or performed, which has led to higher performance. So, the idea is to identify those critical incidents leading to better performance. Okay. And then you have to see that in order to perform those critical incidents, what kind of competencies was observed by the individual. So, basically it is a case of observation, where you go and try to find out what people are doing, and out of that how much is related to what average and daily routine activities, and how much are related to those activities or those incidents which led to failure, okay, that need to be ruled out, okay, and those incidents which have critically or significantly contributed to better performance. So, you need to keep a record of those incidents which significantly lead to better performance, and then you have to see that what competencies were required for that, and that is how you collect the data using this critical incident technique, right. So, you go for critical events, exceptional examples of accomplishments or failures, that is only collected, okay, through observations, questionnaires and interviews, okay, as and when they occur. So, that you can relate them with competence, right, and then you are categorizing them, associate with behaviors, okay, with whether they are related to performance, whether related to the strengths, and then accordingly you can see whether people have those competences which leads to significant performance or not, right. So, critical incident is also very common, which is used by many organizations. Now, after discussing about these tools, you see that how we go about collecting data to identify those characteristics which is required for higher performance. Now, if you look at this, you will find a lot of methods, some of them we have already discussed earlier also, but here I am giving a brief overview of these methods which are used for this purpose. Okay. So, one way to get data about competencies include using resource persons or expert panels, right. It is a very structured process, where job holders, the managers and the training staff align their activities in such a way, so that they are able to see what are the various characteristics which could be required for the success of the individual in a given job. So, basically this expert is going to identify those competencies across these three categories: generic, technical and managerial, which leads to higher performance. Okay. Since this resource person expert panels know the job very well, so they would be in a position to classify those characteristics with respect to generic, technical and managerial competencies, which would be leading to higher performance. Okay. So, that is where you are going to use resource persons or expert panels, right. Apart from that, you can also use critical event interviews, okay, structured interviews with superior performers, okay, and then you can probe them in depth, okay, that through large number of events and experiences which they have related to their job, and you can identify okay, what are the critical events which are very important. Okay. And in order to perform those critical events, what kind of competencies are required by the individual to perform very well, right. Apart from this critical event interviews, we move to some other methods like having a dictionary of generic competencies. Okay. See, as I was discussing about generic competencies, I told you that these generic competencies are required across functions and levels, right. And this, it means that these generic competencies required for all kind of jobs by all kind of peoples, right. So, these are some of the competencies and behaviors which help you to achieve superior performance, right. So, when you are going to build a competency model, so you to start with identifying what are the generic competencies. Okay. Either you use a list of traits or characteristics which is already available, okay, and that is what we know as competency dictionaries. So, these competency dictionaries provide you general traits and characteristics which are required for a performance in an effective way, right. but the only thing here is that all the generic competencies may not be required for all the jobs. So, you have to very specific identify what are the specific set of generic competencies which you can relate with a job, right. For example, at the lower level you may not require leadership competencies, right. You do not require a strategic thinking competencies at a lower level individual or manager, right. So, you need to identify out of a list of competencies what are the competencies that could be applied for a given job, right, and that is where you can take help of resource panel or expert panel. So, this resource panel or expert panel will go through this list, he has the job at hand and what are the things that is done for the job, and then he is going to identify okay, these are the competencies, generic competencies which would be required for effective performance. Later on we will take up a model and discuss how it is done, but here conceptually what I am trying to tell you that your job is to identify those generic competencies which is required for the job, right. Apart from the using generic competencies dictionary, you can also go for literature review. Okay. You can look at different kind of job descriptions that is available. Okay. You can conduct a literature review to find out especially related to job descriptions and job specifications. Okay. These are the characteristics that is required for the job. Okay. And if it is matching with your job, then you can make use of that. Similarly, you can go for some kind of qualitative approach like focus group discussions, where a small number of people who are performing the jobs including their managers and supervisors and including clients also. So, they are going to discuss the content of the job and then they will identify what are the competencies that these jobs require to be performed effectively. And here you are in this focus group, you are going to use a number of stakeholders including external customers, right, maybe suppliers, maybe clients, then you have the managers, okay, the subordinates, the supervisors. So, all of them come together and discuss the required or specific competencies which is important looking at the job content to perform the job effectively. Okay. And that is how we are going to use focus group discussions, and this helps you to identify and crystal clear those competencies which is required for the performance. Then apart from focus group, we also go for structured interviews. In a interview is a face to face situation, we are going to ask certain questions. Okay. It could be structured or it could be unstructured. In unstructured question, what happens? You do not go prepared and you ask whatever questions come to your mind depending upon the requirement, but you are not prepared. But in a structured interview, what happens? You come prepared, you plan what are the questions that you are going to ask to the individual who is performing the jobs, not only to the individuals, but you are also going to ask these kind of questions maybe to his clients, his managers or others who are part of the job or who are somehow associated with the job. So, but the set of questions that you have planned for each category of people who are going to be interviewed is going to be different, okay, which is going to give you very good data related to the competencies that would be required. Okay. So, maybe from job incumbents you can ask what kind of competencies is required, what kind of knowledge skill would be required. From managers you can ask, okay, this is the job, this person is doing job. So, what are the competencies that you expect him to have? Similarly, from the customers you can ask, okay, suppliers you can ask, vendors you can ask, okay, since they are associated with these kind of jobs depending upon the nature of the job, right. So, structured interview is very good and it has been used to identify these kind of things. Moving further, we have benchmark interviews, then we go for benchmarking interview with other organizations also, okay, that how they have been able to achieve a broader view of the job to determine what are the competencies which is universally deemed necessary for a given job. Especially these kind of things can be done to identify generic competencies to some extent and managerial competencies, because if you are going to talk about technical or functional competencies, this is not going to be derived from this much, because technical competencies are very job specific, which is going to vary from one job to another job, and that is where it becomes very difficult to use structured interview unless this interview is specifically belonging to that particular job, right. But you can derive rich data using these kind of interviews when it comes to identifying more generic competencies. Then apart from that, we also have some other methods for data collection like behavior event interviews, okay, where top performers are interviews individually, how did they thought and felt in a challenging or difficult situation. So, whatever data is coming out of it has to be used for this purpose, and then this is going to help you to identify what are the things that high performing individuals do in order to perform their job effectively. But here again you are going for a, you can go for an interview based on the different events that have been performed, okay? And then you try to relate the event with the competencies, and then you go and then you become more exploratory in your process, okay, where you are trying to see that okay, these are the things that is to be done, and these are the things are in terms of competencies that is required to cope up with these kind of situations and challenges, right. So, behavior event interview is very popular, and this could be used especially with top performers to identify their perspective, right. So, what they will do? They will try to identify those competencies, and you can identify those competencies which are instrumental in success of the individual, and then you can extrapolate from their stories, right. They say okay, so this is what I did and this is how I have been able to perform very well. So, you need to filter out the content that is coming out from the discussions that goes on, okay, and that is where we are going to see that if this job is to be done by an average performer or poor performer, what kind of content is being provided to them, and then you can compare them to see that okay, this is how we relate to superior performance or average performance, right. Then the other methods that could be used like survey methods, that is very popular, okay, where you can send questionnaires, structured questionnaires, okay, to the senior managers or other people who are stakeholders in the process, okay, and then you collect the data, you analyze the data and find out the content, and then you can see okay, these are the competencies, you can do it, you can use certain statistical modeling also here to find out through factor analysis and other things. Okay, these are the competencies which significantly contribute to the performance of the individual, especially in case of high performance individual, right. Apart from surveys, you can also go for observations. This is the best method because that is where you get actually collect very rich data, right. So, what you can do, the research team can visit the high performing incumbents and observe how they are doing their job. Okay. So, since some job which they are doing might be very complex in nature, and there could be different kind of variety which they are doing. Okay. So, when you are going for observations, you know that it is going to be very time consuming process, because you cannot leave in between once the person starts doing it and unless it is finished, right. So, for the entire duration you are going to see that how he is doing, what kind of competencies is being used by him, and then it could be supplemented by behavioral event interviews to explore it further. Okay, these are the competencies which is required by the individual to perform their job very well, right. So, these were the methods that we have been using. Now, which method to use and why, right. So, whether you are going to use a approach which is less rigorous or which is going to be more rigorous. So, if you look at some of the techniques that is mentioned here, starting with using a generic model, moving to more adaptive general model or survey driven, or using expert panel, or moving to behavioral event interviews. Okay. So, you are actually trying to be more rigorous. So, it is always good not to go for say using those methods which are less rigorous, but you use those methods like go for behavioral event interviews, okay, or expert panels, other methods, critical incidents, or content analysis, or using assessment centers, okay, which are very rigorous and which gives you rich data. The idea is that when you are going to identify these competencies, make sure that you get good data, okay, and there are certain considerations that is to be kept into mind when you are going to collect data, right. How practical it is to get the data. For example, is it possible to go for observation in a particular context or not? If it is not, then you cannot use it. Okay. How fair it is, I mean in terms of getting the data, right. Similarly, speed of suppose it is taking too much time or it is taking less time, how much time you have at your disposal, and then finally looking at the validity. Are you really trying to measure those things which are required, whether really these are related to the kind of competencies that you are looking forward to or not. So, these are some of the considerations, and then accordingly you decide which approach or which methods you are going to use for data collection. So, far as concerned of this competencies identification is concerned, right there, right. And finally, these are the steps that we are going to use in the model building. First, you try to collect information about the organization, then you look at the job that is to be taken up for competency models, okay. then you find out why you are going to do it, because it involves certain costs, what are the applications for what you are going to do it, that is very important. Then you use the appropriate data collection method for collecting information related to the competencies, you organize the data, analyze the data, right, and then you identify the themes and patterns related to the competencies, right, and based on that you develop a competency profile, a competency map, and that is how we go about mapping the competencies or building a competency model for a given job, right. Okay. And then you can review this model periodically depending upon the kind of information, depending upon the information related to the job, organization. If there are certain changes, then you can go for reviewing the model and then you go for recollecting the data and again go for the same process again in order to build the model. Okay. And that is what we have been discussing so far. So, first of all you go about looking into the goals and objectives of the organization, then translating them into your actual plan, and that is done through the structures, roles and processes and positions, and finally, you identify the competencies which is required by the job as also required for the organization, right. So, what we have discussed here is that how do we carry out this exercise using certain tools and techniques, so that you are able to build a model and map the competencies of the people. Thank you very much.